The Ground Truth, The Untold Story of America Under Attack on 9/11, by John Farmer, narrated by Patrick Lawlor. Copyright 2009 by John Farmer. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Riverhead Books, a division of Penguin Group USA Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2009 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Introduction. The View from the Ground. The story of the al-Qaeda terrorist plot that culminated in the 9/11 attacks, and of the American government's response to it, has been told well from differing perspectives on several occasions. The report of the Congressional Joint Inquiry is a fascinating and often scathing reconstruction of FBI and CIA activity before 9/11. The 9/11 Commission report, which I assisted in writing, recounts accurately the events as we were able to reconstruct them. It is the collaborative work of a remarkably diverse and talented group of staffers and commissioners. Steve Call's Ghost Wars and Lawrence Wright's The Looming Tower focus on developments in Afghanistan and the evolving al-Qaeda organization, respectively, and are both outstanding. With respect to NORAD's immediate response to the attacks, Michael Bronner, with whom I consulted during his work on the Universal Pictures production of United 93, gets it right in an excellent piece in the August 2006 edition of Vanity Fair. The work of the 9/11 Commission itself has been documented by Commission Chairman and Vice Chairman Tom Keene and Lee Hamilton in their book Without Precedent. Why then another book about 9/11? Put simply, the story could not be told as it is told here before now. In particular, 3 developments since the issuance of the 9/11 Commission report have made possible and necessary this re-examination of our nation's response. The declassification of many of the primary source records of the day, which makes it possible to portray the events as they were lived. The release of investigative reports by the Inspectors General of the Departments of Defense and Transportation, which, I shall argue, ignore critical evidence in concluding that government officials did not knowingly mislead the public about the events of 9/11. And the occurrence of Hurricane Katrina, which sheds essential, if tragic, light on the government's failure to recognize and learn from the ground truth of 9/11. The account of the nation's response to the 9/11 attacks set forth in the 9/11 Commission report is accurate and true, but the vast majority of the tape recordings, transcripts, and contemporaneous records from September 11, 2001 were treated as classified throughout the investigation, ostensibly because of their possible use as evidence in the prosecution of Zacarias Moussaoui. Although we on the Commission sought to declassify the relevant records, we were working against a stringent deadline. An audio monograph of the day's events, an account that allowed the voices of the day to tell the story that we prepared, did not survive the vetting process, and a supplemental monograph that we prepared, which was finally released in January 2005, was drastically condensed and had significant sections blacked out. Only now that most of the relevant tapes and transcripts have been declassified is it possible to tell the story in all of its drama. That more complete primary source record sheds light on an important but little noticed aspect of the 9/11 story. In the course of our investigation into the national response to the attacks, the 9/11 Commission staff discovered that the official version of what had occurred that morning, that is, what the government and military officials had told Congress, the Commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when, was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. Pressed for time and committed to the central purpose of finding the facts, however, the Commission had referred the issue of whether any of these officials had knowingly lied to or misled the public about the facts of that day to the Inspectors General of the Department of Defense and the Department of Transportation. Months passed, then a year, then 2 years, a period longer than the life of the Commission itself. Finally, on September 11, 2006, the Friday afternoon before Labor Day, the Department of Transportation Inspector General released its report. This was followed on September 12, 2006, the day after the anniversary of the attacks when the attendant media scrutiny had subsided, by the release of the Department of Defense Inspector General's report. The releases of both reports were timed, in short, to attract as little notice as possible, despite, or perhaps because of, both reports' conclusion that there was no proof of deliberate falsification. The Department of Transportation Inspector General's report ascribed the false information Federal Aviation Administration officials had provided to a lack of attention to the details. And although it found FAA officials' explanations unreasonable, it did not find evidence for an alternative explanation. The Department of Defense Inspector General's report ascribed the inaccuracies of Pentagon officials to their being focused at that point not on what had occurred, but on the struggle to protect the homeland. It also claimed that efforts to piece together what had occurred were compromised by the military's inadequate record-keeping procedures on 9/11. This book challenges these conclusions. It does so by setting forth in detail and as the events were lived what happened on 9/11 and in the days that followed, including how the government's explanation of events evolved. Not only did the Department of Defense maintain adequate records, principally tapes at the National Military Command Center and at every operational position in the Northeast Air Defense Sector, NEADS, and contemporaneous logs maintained at every level up and down the chain of command, but the events of the day as recorded in the records were both unmistakable and unmistakably different from what officials had claimed. Furthermore, as 9/11 Commissioners Gorelick, Benvenisti, and Gorton have pointed out, those records were consulted as early as the first few days after the attacks, as the bureaucracy pieced together what had occurred. At some level of the government, at some point in time, this book concludes, there was a decision not to tell the truth about what happened. The ground truth retells the 9/11 story in a new and I hope exciting and illuminating way, not primarily in terms of the evolution of doctrines or the interplay of departments or personalities, but in units of time. My purpose is to discuss our government's growing awareness of and reaction to the Al-Qaeda terrorist threat as it was lived, when the government had first years, then months, then weeks, then days, then hours, then minutes, and finally seconds to redefine its mission and respond. This way of organizing the narrative makes for an exciting, true-to-life listen. As the units of time are compressed, and the number of national security agencies and actors capable of interdicting the plot narrows to two relatively obscure units, the FAA and NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the story of 9/11 acquires a narrative momentum that is no less compelling for our knowledge of how the story ends. Equally important, telling the story in shrinking units of time is the best way to appreciate both the uniqueness of what happened that morning and its remarkable similarity to all that had led up to this encounter with a new form of warfare. Of all the misleading accounts told by a government to its people, our government's account to its people about what happened on 9/11 is certainly not the most egregious. It didn't cause a war, as did the McKinley administration's lie that the Maine had been sunk in Havana Harbor by a Spanish mine in 1898. Nor did it cause an escalation of a war, as did the Johnson administration's fabrication of the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1965. It didn't provide a pretext for aggression, as did the government's manipulation of intelligence regarding the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Nor did it precipitate a constitutional crisis, as did the Nixon administration's lies about Watergate or President Clinton's lies about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. In the grand scheme of things, then, the government's deception about how we were defended on 9/11 may seem minor. This book in no way seeks to overstate its significance. In its own way, however, the government's failure to tell the truth about what happened on 9/11 has had far-reaching effects. Because the government's story didn't make sense, it raised as many questions as it answered, thus fueling conspiracy theories that persist regarding 9/11. One purpose of The Ground Truth is to lay at least some of these theories to rest by identifying and establishing the deception that actually did occur. The perpetuation of the untrue official version remains a betrayal of every citizen who demanded a truthful answer to the simple question, what happened? More important, because the government's version of what occurred on 9/11 overstated the efficiency and effectiveness of our national defense response, it obscured that day's essential reality and its causes, a radical disconnect between those who were putatively in charge of conducting our nation's defense and those who were on the ground making operational decisions. Because the government didn't tell the truth, in other words, we lost the ground truths of 9/11. 1. There was no connection or collaboration between Washington and the ground-level commanders, as a result of which, 2. Our national decision-makers in Washington, or in the case of President Bush, in the air, were irrelevant to how we were defended during that critical time period. Leadership was irrelevant on 9/11, moreover, not because of how quickly the critical events happened, essentially within a 2-hour period, but because there had been a persistent and pervasive estrangement throughout the 1990s between leadership of the national security departments and the ground-level bureaucratic personnel, as the government attempted to adapt to the world's changing post-Cold War realities. The government's failure to acknowledge the radical disconnect made it easy to respond to the 9/11 attacks by the predictable method of creating a new bureaucracy, the Department of Homeland Security, while responding to the immediate conditions of the last attack, patching the holes in the air defense system by ensuring connectivity between the FAA and NORAD, modernizing radar coverage, revising the applicable rules of engagement to enable a quicker response the next time planes are hijacked for use as weapons. But the next attack is unlikely to duplicate the last, and the deficiencies in the response to 9/11, once they are appreciated, point to a more fundamental problem. They were a direct consequence of the way that government bureaucracies function, as top-heavy silos of isolated and narrowly defined missions, jealous of the information to which they are privy, and structured not to solve problems, but to deflect responsibility. In this sense, as we shall see, the problems that plagued FAA and NORAD on 9/11 itself were no different from those faced by the FBI, the CIA, the DoD, INS, or the other agencies of the federal bureaucracy in the years, months, weeks, and days leading to 9/11. The compressed time frame within which the FAA and NORAD had to act simply made those problems more glaringly apparent and, perhaps, more painful to admit. By obscuring the truth of what happened on 9/11, the government was able to avoid confronting the consequences of that ground truth, that the fault for failing to detect or to interdict the attacks lay in the nature of modern government itself, and that until we address the way that bureaucracies function, until we truly reinvent government, the passage of new statutes or the creation of new procedures or entirely new departments like the Department of Homeland Security will be unavailing. Thus, Congress responded to the principal recommendation of the 9/11 Commission by creating a new office, the Director of National Intelligence, but ignored completely the Commission's insistence that the office have budgetary authority over the intelligence community in order to be effective. Instead, it left 80% of the intelligence budget under the authority of the Department of Defense. As 9/11 Commissioner John Lehman pointed out, such an approach was the exact opposite of what we had recommended, because it left the sprawling mess of our national intelligence bureaucracy untouched, to create another bureaucracy of more than 1,000 people in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Unless we change government, we will fail to protect ourselves with horrifying consequences, as was made painfully clear in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina. As I will show, the problems the government encountered in responding to Katrina mirrored and in many cases replicated the problems experienced on 9/11. These similarities are the more significant because, unlike 9/11, Katrina was not a surprise, but an event that had been forecast and planned for years ahead of time. That government failed in identical ways in preparing for and responding to such disparate events makes clear that the problems were not incidental to unique events, but central to the American way of government. The aftermaths of both 9/11 and Katrina were a bacchanalia of blame. If the failures had occurred in a single agency of government with respect to a single crisis, the assessment of individual blame would be appropriate. But when the failure occurs in multiple departments across the government in differing crises and is of virtually the same nature regardless of who is leading the department, such individual scapegoating misses the point. What failed in the history of 9/11 and in the Katrina crisis was not an individual department head or two, but government itself. If we are to address the systemic failures that undermined our nation's responses to the 9/11 attacks and Katrina, we must change fundamentally the way government functions. This conclusion stems not just from having studied 9/11 as senior counsel to the 9/11 Commission, but also from having experienced it and attempted to manage it and other crises as the head of a large governmental agency. From June 1999 until January 2002, I served as New Jersey's Attorney General, leading a department of nearly 10,000 people, including nearly 700 lawyers and nearly 3,000 officers of the New Jersey State Police, with a budget of nearly $1 billion. I have experienced firsthand just how difficult it is to reorient a government bureaucracy in the face of new realities. I brought to my work on the 9/11 Commission and to my study of Hurricane Katrina the perspective gained by managing crises such as 9/11, the anthrax attacks of 2001, and Tropical Storm Floyd, and addressing troubling social issues such as racial profiling and sexual predators. My work on the Commission and in learning about Katrina, in turn, have reinforced my belief that there are some basic truths about the ways in which government agencies function that must be addressed if we are to prepare for and respond effectively to future crises. In joining the discussion of how to change government, the ground truth demonstrates precisely how government failed in dealing with the 9/11 conspiracy. It portrays the national defense story of 9/11 as the events were actually experienced that morning. It shows that those events were the trailing consequence of policy decisions taken years, even decades before. Only by experiencing the attacks as they occurred can one appreciate the dislocation to which the military's air defenders and the FAA's civilian air traffic controllers were subjected, and the crucible of their having to think and react outside the box. Equally important, only by learning about the human drama of that effort can one evaluate in its proper context the rhetoric throughout the 1990s about reinventing government and defending America in the post-Cold War world. The response on the ground on 9/11 was the trailing consequence of those post-Cold War policy debates, the dysfunctional choices they produced, and the government-wide failure to interdict the 9/11 plot. It is the most powerful challenge to the claims of the departing Clinton administration that it had successfully reinvented government to meet post-Cold War challenges and that terrorism had been its highest national security priority, and of the Bush administration that it had mobilized to counter the threat. Given the state of national preparedness that I shall describe and the way that the national defense was conducted, those claims simply cannot be true. The failure to anticipate the attacks of 9/11 was, indeed, as the Commission concluded, a failure of imagination. But it was more than that. It was a collapse of competence and an exposure of the continuing need for fundamental change in the ways in which departments of government are permitted to function. It is impossible, in other words, to separate the way the defense of America against the 9/11 attacks was conducted from the way the systems designed to prevent a surprise attack on America were configured. As we shall see, because of the essential estrangement between policy leaders and the personnel of the departments they led, despite all the debates and discussion, our national defense apparatus, both domestic and foreign, had been left largely unchanged. This is the essential truth of our national response on 9/11. For all of the rhetoric and all of the billions of dollars of government spending to reinvent government to adapt to the challenges of a new world order, the Cold War did not end in 1991. For all practical purposes, it did not end until 9:03 a.m. on September 11, 2001, when United Airlines Flight 175, the second hijacked plane, crashed into the second tower of the World Trade Center. Only then did it become apparent that America was under attack. Later that morning, as Air National Guard personnel searched their antiquated radar scopes for phantom hijacked aircraft, a staff sergeant on the floor at the Northeast Air Defense Sector in Rome, New York, stated what so many across the government were thinking. This is a new kind of war. Tragically, it was. This is its story. Part 1. Years. The evolution of the Plains Conspiracy and of the U.S. government's attempts to counter al-Qaeda has received comprehensive book-length treatment in the 9/11 Commission Report, in Steve Call's Ghost Wars, and in Lawrence Wright's The Looming Tower. The following sections do not attempt to replicate that history, but draw from it to set the context for the government's response on September 11 by highlighting the ways in which the evolving conspiracy touched upon various components of America's vast and far-flung early warning system. As the conspiracy grew from its origins in Afghanistan to include more participants in more parts of the world, accessing more types of travel and communication technologies, it became susceptible to detection by one or more of the multitude of American national security and law enforcement agencies. Each agency's alert system, from the Central Intelligence Agency's human intelligence to the National Security Agency's electronic eavesdropping to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's network of field offices, would register what amounted to seismic indications of what became the 9/11 conspiracy. But the greater fault lines lay within and among the agencies themselves. These fault lines estranged the top officials within departments who set policy from the career professionals who carry it out, and ensured that the seismic readings taken in one department were not shared with other departments. As a consequence, even though the seismic disturbances grew stronger and stronger as 9/11 approached, every effort to get a clear reading was frustrated. Two Men in a Cave, 1996 to 1997. Like many watershed historical events, the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 have acquired, in the perspective of 8 years, a patina of inevitability. For al-Qaeda members, it has become Holy Tuesday, its consequences bearing a divine signature. But to two men meeting in a cave in Tora Bora, Afghanistan in mid-1996 to discuss potential attacks against the United States, the success of the Plains operation they would mastermind nearly 5 years later seemed anything but inevitable. The two men were Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Although their paths had crossed briefly during the jihad against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s, they had pursued independent and largely parallel paths since. Bin Laden had come to his willingness to attack the United States gradually. A man of ascetic temperament who, unlike many of his siblings in a billionaire family, had been educated not in the West, but in Saudi Arabia, and had seen little of the non-Muslim world, bin Laden's worldview was initially parochial, even as his world ambition was global. Like many in the Islamist fundamentalist world of the late 1980s, bin Laden believed that, as one commentator summarized it, the secular Arab governments must be overthrown before the greater enemy, the West, can be tackled. Once the communist threat had been removed from Afghanistan, the consensus among jihadists was that the next phase of jihad should concentrate upon its own state context, whose regime is the nearest enemy in Muslim legal lingo. Further away enemies, such as the State of Israel or the United States, are to be tackled later, after the seizure of power. Lawrence Wright puts it this way: what did bin Laden want? The tragedy of Palestine was a constant theme in his speeches, yet he was reluctant to participate in the intifada against Israel. Bin Laden hated Yasser Arafat because he was a secularist. Nor did he relish the prospect of war against Arab governments. At the time, he envisioned moving the struggle to Kashmir, the Philippines, and particularly the Central Asian republics, where he could continue the jihad against the Soviet Union. Notably, the United States was not yet on anyone's list. Over time, however, as it became clear that jihad in oppressive states like Egypt or Saudi Arabia would be exceedingly difficult to carry out, and as his base of operations moved from Afghanistan to Sudan to Saudi Arabia and back to Afghanistan, bin Laden came to see the United States as the head of the snake, the source of support for both Israel and the corrupt Middle Eastern governments against which he struggled, and beyond this, the source of evil and corruption in the world. America continues to claim that it is upholding the banner of freedom and humanity, bin Laden would tell an interviewer in November 1996, while these deeds that they did, the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the imposition of sanctions on Iraq, you would not find that the most ravenous of animals would descend to. Stung by the refusal of the Saudi government to allow him to raise an army of mujahideen to drive the Iraqis from Kuwait, and its reliance instead on the United States military, bin Laden turned on the Saudi government that had enriched his family and called for jihad to end the sacrilege of a non-Muslim presence in Arabia. From his new base in Sudan, bin Laden denounced both his home Saudi government and the United States, and al-Qaeda leaders issued a fatwa calling for jihad against the Western occupation of Muslim lands. Bin Laden used Sudan as his base from 1992 to 1996. During this time, al-Qaeda became increasingly confrontational with the United States. Al-Qaeda operatives bombed 2 hotels in Aden, where United States military personnel typically stayed en route to Somalia, and played a role in supporting the Somali warlords who shot down 2 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters in 1993. Al-Qaeda claims the United States withdrawal from Somalia in 1994 as a major victory. In November 1995, a car bomb was detonated outside a joint United States-Saudi National Guard training facility in Riyadh. Credit was later claimed by al-Qaeda associates. Ultimately, international pressure brought upon the Sudanese government, particularly from the United States, led that government to expel bin Laden in 1996. He returned to Afghanistan, determined to strike the United States as his primary enemy. As Michael Scheuer, the former head analyst of the CIA's bin Laden unit, put it, bin Laden labored in public and in private to reverse the sequence in which Arab governments are attacked and overthrown, followed by the United States, and claimed that if the United States is beheaded, the Arab kingdoms will wither away. It was with this mindset that bin Laden sat down in mid-1996 with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM as he has become known, differed from bin Laden in almost every respect. Where bin Laden is tall and exceptionally thin, KSM is shorter and portly. Where bin Laden is ascetic, KSM is worldly. Lawrence Wright describes him as pious but poorly trained in religion, an actor and a cut-up, a drinker and a womanizer. Whereas bin Laden was provincial and hated travel, especially in the West, Mohammed was a globe-trotter fluent in several languages, including English, which he perfected while studying mechanical engineering.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?